Presenting about stretching and mobility. You'll notice that this was originally a presentation from one of our personal trainers and group fitness instructors, Genese Kerns. Unfortunately, we had some technical problems as we tried to make that happen, so here I am in her stead trying to give this presentation. So if you notice some additional stammering, interruptions, pauses for thought, that's what's happened. So I'm going to do my best to inform you all based on that same PowerPoint and give you all the necessary information. So, stretching and mobility. Why it matters. What you're going to notice here is that we are not putting an emphasis in this presentation of how to touch your toes. The point of this presentation is to teach you the key parts of stretching and mobility that allow you to maintain range of motion, to maintain your independence, to avoid injury, and we'll talk about all the different ways that stretching and mobility affect that and how we can go about it properly. So, stretching versus mobility, they are not the same thing. What is the point of stretching? Well, stretching is intended to improve flexibility via we are lengthening the muscle that's being targeted, okay? When it comes to mobility, what we're doing is we're making that very same flexibility actionable. So mobility focuses more so on joint control through the range of motion. You'll notice that sometimes mobility is done with a light amount of weight. You'll also notice that in almost all cases, we are much more controlled and mobile, hence mobility, as we go through mobility training versus most stretching. We're talking about holding a position and gently deepening it, okay? All right, let's move forward. Oh, real quick before I move on, some of you, based on that, as you look at this combines flexibility and strength, you may wonder, well, how is mobility different than strength training if I'm still working my way through a range of motion? And to answer that, strength training focuses specifically on force production, on building muscle mass, and from that, or to make that happen, it requires a certain level of tension. In other words, we need heavier loads in order to reach those adaptations we're searching for. When it comes to mobility training, we are not utilizing enough load to get those strength, muscle mass, force production adaptations. So, again, strength training has a very specific purpose. This today is going to be about lengthening muscles, about learning to control our joints as we move through a range of motion, things like that. Quick example, actually, before we move on. So you see me, I've been subtly doing a little bit of something as I move about up here. But just a quick example, we have a hamstring stretch, right? Feeling that muscle tendon lengthen down the back of my leg, versus mobility example was a controlled leg swing. So here we have a leg swing versus a stretch. Now, in both of those actions, we are having something to do with the hamstring, but very different results that we're looking for, a little bit different movements. So now we're looking at two different kinds of stretching. We have static, we have dynamic. Now you may look at this and wonder, well, in which case should we use each? And lucky you, it's written up there. So you'll see static stretching best used after a workout or in separate sessions. And then over here with dynamic stretching, this is typically something we want to do before workouts as a means of priming ourselves for that movement. Again, when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about things like raising our core temperature, like getting our blood flowing so that when we come to the actual exercise part of the workout, we have the ability to do so properly. We may look at this and say, well, it sounds like dynamic stretching is basically the same thing as mobility. And that's somewhat true. It is one tool within mobility training that we can use. Again, its primary purpose is to warm up the body, while mobility's purpose is we're learning control through a range of motion, right? So, an example, just to see the difference between the two. We talked a little bit earlier about we had the hamstring stretch, then we had the leg swing. So a version of dynamic stretching, we have a leg swing, okay? Now, normally you're going to want to stabilize yourself as you do this. Don't take this too literally, but there's your dynamic stretch. Now when it was to come to mobility, we might alter that a little bit and instead say we're focused more on control throughout the range of motion, slow, controlled, deliberate movement, focusing on that joint control, and we may stop more so at the end range of that motion as we're working to build strength in the end ranges when it comes to mobility training. Clear as day, clear as mud, good deal. Okay, so moving forward. Best practices for stretching. So when it comes to stretching, and you're going to see in this next slide, we're basically going to go through best practice, and then we're going to go through common mistakes that are made, and sort of you're going to see a lot of crossover between the two. But stretch warm muscles. Stretching cold muscles is a very easy way to lead to injury. We have moved slowly into stretches. There is no reason whatsoever for us to rush when it comes to these stretches. Hold stretches without bouncing. So when we say bouncing, let's take a forward fold stretch, right? I shouldn't see this number to try to get us deeper into a stretch, to try to utilize momentum, right? We want to be slow, controlled, deliberate, whether it is mobility or whether it is a static stretch. So in that case, right, I'm going to come to that in range of motion and hold. I'm not bouncing about. I skipped focusing on breathing. So when I'm stretching, there is no reason for me to be holding my breath. There is no reason for me to be panting. This is a relaxed movement, right? So when we say focus on breathing, just be cognizant of that breathing as you move. Is it calm? Is it steady? Am I bracing properly? Am I breathing in through my nose, into my diaphragm, out through my mouth, right? Stretch both sides equally. There is no reason that we should be just stretching one side, even if that one side feels like it's the problem area. We're going to still stretch both sides. We want to make sure to have that consistency between the two. Speaking of consistency, we want to be stretching at least 3 to 5 times per week. We don't want to be addressing problem areas retroactively, right? So when it comes to preventative medicine, aka addressing the problem before it arrives, we want to be consistent. So make that a pattern. Common stretching mistakes. So again, in tandem with what we just talked about, you're going to see a lot of things that are repetitive here. But some key areas we want to point out. Stretching through pain, no. Only stretching tight areas, no. That's what we're going to harp on real quick here. So when it comes to effective stretching, what we care about is that it creates mild tension, not pain. It is a myth that if a stretch hurts, it's working, right? We are not trying to push ourselves to the point where you say, ow. Some of you may say it in jest as you're stretching, but there should never be a point of actual sharp pain in a muscle as you stretch it. In fact, one other thing we're going to talk about, right? Let's say tight areas, that does not necessarily mean that the muscle needs to be stretched, okay? Tightness can be indicative of a muscle that's trying to compensate for joint instability. And you may say, why did you just use all those big words? Make it simple, stupid. Okay, so let's take a case example. We have a hip joint, multiple muscles that attach to it, or to the pelvis. So in this situation, we've got someone that's come forward with, we keep using hamstrings, let's go hamstrings again. So we've got tight hamstrings, that big muscle back of the leg. And some people may say the way to address that is, well, now I need to do hamstring stretches. Contrary to popular belief, that may not be the best way to address it. What you may be experiencing is that the hamstrings are having to compensate for the rest of the posterior chain being weak. So for example, it may be that that is overcompensating for weakened glutes. In this case, it would make more sense to, instead of stretching the hamstring, perform exercises to strengthen or even just gain stability of the glutes. Basically, the body senses that joint instability down here and responds by engaging other muscles to make up for the fact that this one is not properly engaging. And for that reason, the hamstring is overworked and underpaid, while the glutes are just up here riding along. So what we need to do instead of stretching that hamstring is now strengthen that glute area. That's just one such example of where tightness does not necessarily mean stretching is the answer. Okay? So, moving right along. Why is mobility important as we age? Now, I'm going to make a bold statement here that a lot of this is pretty easy to understand. We talked about a lot of this early on. Not sure exactly if Genese had extra points to make on this slide, but for now, I'm just going to give you all a look, let you see what the information is here. Okay, so I guess something I would add is that as we age, a decline in mobility is normal. However, it is very trainable for us to try to maintain to the best of our ability what we currently have, and at times even improve it. Okay, best practices when it comes to mobility training. Moving through full, comfortable range of motion. Some of you that have attended weight equipment orientation are familiar with hearing me say that you should have a range of motion that is as big as possible, that is pain-free. In other words, if you can do a shoulder press that starts way down here because you have that level of mobility in your shoulders, fantastic. But if this hurts, starting up here is not bad. You should move with the maximal pain-free range of motion, whether that is strength training, whether that is stretch and mobility training. Okay? Focus on controlled movements. We talked about that a little earlier. We're not trying to speed through this. We're not trying to bounce around. We are trying to move with control, especially when it comes to mobility training, because we're trying to build that joint control. Slow, deliberate reps, that seems to be the same thing, including multiple planes of motion. And you've got a few examples of here, but I'm going to take it and make it a little bit more visible for you. So when it comes to multiple planes of motion, we've got 3. First one is going to be sagittal plane. Sagittal plane is front and back. So for example, something like a lunge is a movement in the sagittal plane. Second plane is going to be the frontal plane. Frontal plane essentially encapsulates side-to-side movement. So taking that same theory, I'm going to instead go for a side lunge now and work through that range of motion. And then finally we have the transverse plane. Transverse plane is essentially rotational movements. So in this case, we're talking mobility. It may be something as simple as a trunk rotation, slow and under control. Okay? So when we talk about mobility training, excellent to include all 3 planes of motion. Now, not every muscle group is going to move through all 3 planes of motion, but we're trying to involve as much as possible because we move in so many different ways in our day-to-day, in our activities, pickleball, golf, all the others. Okay? So moving forward here, we have specific mobility areas for 50 plus. This is very good. I'm going to step away here and make sure that you guys can see all of that. Take your notes if you're taking notes, and let's talk specifically about some of these specific joints and how we can address them. So, shoulder and upper back. What kind of mobility movements can we include for shoulders and upper back? First example that comes to mind is a wall slide. So you would back up to a wall. I don't really have a good one here other than the TV, but let's imagine that the back of my arms are pinned to a wall, and a wall slide is simply sliding those arms up and down while they're in contact with the wall. We have arm circles. Those arm circles can get progressively bigger as we feel comfortable. And then if you happen to have a band with you, band pull-aparts are another good example of some shoulders and upper back mobility. Okay? Imagine my band there. Next we have hips. So when it comes to hips, a couple good movements we have if we're talking about not just singular plane of motion type deal. We have a hip rotation. So one example, normally I would recommend stabilizing yourself against something, but lifting up, rotating around, and then back to the start. So we've got some hip flexion coming up and then rotating around. Some people will call this a car. That is a controlled articular rotation. Don't get confused by it. Just think hip circle. Very easy. Another such example for the hips would be a glute bridge, right? You can add bands to that. You can add light weights to it like we talked about earlier, but that is a great way to start to address some hip issues or address them proactively. Next one, problem area we've got up here is ankles. So a couple different ankle examples. We have the traditional calf raise, which I'm sure you have seen over and over and over. Now notice that slow and controlled up and down. We're not sitting here bouncing around. We're slow and controlled. You also see, I don't know if you can see all the way down here, but we have ankle circles. This is a very common ankle mobility exercise. If you can't see down there, just imagine basically rotating at the ankle joint. And then if we want to actually get a little movement involved here, we could do toe walks. So getting up on our toes and just slow and controlled, working on that stability throughout the ankle joint while moving. And then finally we have the thoracic spine. I'm not going to get down here on the floor today, so we're going to work through some examples in the air. So thoracic spine is not up here near your neck. It's not down here in your lower back. It's basically your middle back there. So we have cat-cow, for those that are unfamiliar. basically working through the arch. There are different arches of the spine. This is usually done in a quadruped position, but I really don't think you're going to be able to see me down there on the ground. We have trunk rotations. So we sort of talked through this already, but a nice slow and controlled rotation, trying to keep a neutral up and down spine rather than bending as we go. And those are some basic examples to have for these 4 problem areas. Again, I'll step aside and let you look at those real quick one last time. Okay, moving forward. How to build a simple routine. So we've got basically a pre-workout or maybe a daily thing that's away from the gym, and then we've got a post-workout. So some simple tips here. Like we talked about earlier, cold muscles are a great way to get injured. So the first thing we want to do when we're doing stretching, when we're doing mobility, is get the blood flowing, get that core temperature raised, get those muscles feeling primed for movement. And the way that we're often going to do that is some low intensity, some sort of cardio, some sort of aerobic activity. That could look like walking, that could look like marching, that could look like hopping on a bike, hopping on a recumbent elliptical. Those are just some really basic examples that you could use. Next thing we're going to go into is, now that the muscles are primed for movement, we're going to go into some dynamic stretching or mobility. You've got a couple examples up there. This one's working through those basically 4 major areas that we just talked about. So you've got arm circles, hip circles, spinal rotation, and then down to ankle mobility work. Post-workout, this is when you're going to see that integration of those static stretches. So you see we have some major muscle groups listed that sort of correlate to what we were hopefully working in the workout over here. And for both of those, that 2 to 4 sets, 15 to 60 seconds is a very generic description. But in most cases, something in that ballpark is going to be really good for you. If you might need something more specific, great idea to go ahead and consult, whether it's a physician, whether it's a personal trainer. All right, when to be cautious and how to be cautious. So I mentioned a little bit earlier when we were talking about range of motion how we never want to feel that sharp stabbing pain. That's indicative that we have a real problem there. That is a, hey, we need to stop. Numbness or tingling, that's typically an indication that we have some sort of nerve issue going on or lack of circulation. Something is stopping that, and so we want to stop in those cases. Joint instability. If you are performing some sort of exercise, mobility, stretch, etc., and you notice that you just don't feel balanced, right? Somewhere along the kinetic chain, something is imbalanced. We need to go ahead and stop there. Or if you are someone who has a long-standing injury that suddenly flares up, right? So those are our when to be cautious. I would almost advocate for going ahead and stopping. Now, on the other end, you say how to be cautious. In those moments, should stopping not be the right case, we have modifications. Now, when we talk about modifications, most of the time when it comes to we have pain or instability, we're going to regress a movement. So let's say, very simple example here, we're doing those trunk rotations. We're doing it standing, and we notice that there's some pain in the low back, something like that. We might decide to remove some of the variables, regress it a little bit, and say, now I'm going to take a seat, and I'm going to perform a seated trunk rotation and see if removing my lower body from the movement makes this a little bit more feasible for me. Can I do that without pain? And there's different regressions for different movement patterns, and you can certainly look those up or inquire to a personal trainer, a physician, etc. Speak of the devils, and there they are. Consult a trainer or a medical professional when needed. And needed is not some sort of hard set standard. That is, if you feel you need help, feel free to ask. If we happen to have personal trainers that are available, they are very good about helping you out. All right, moving forward. Key takeaways. So I think that basically encapsulates everything we sort of talked about here today. If you have any specific questions, I know this is going to be a lot more difficult considering that we're having to retroactively do this instead of just use Genese's initial presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop those down in the comments. We really appreciate the opportunity to know what else people may want some education on. And if that does not work for you, you feel free to shoot us an email, contact us here at Parks and Recreation, and we will be happy to take that into consideration and inform you how we can. Thank you guys so much for watching. We look forward to seeing you in the next presentation.